June 1890 brought with it the relentless heat of southern Utah and a federal census taker whose instincts were about to be shattered forever. William Porter, a 34-year-old official responsible for cataloging residences for the national census, expected to find rural properties scattered across the territory, Mormon families in their known routines, perhaps some colonists isolated by deliberate choice. What awaited him in a forgotten structure in the arid mountains near the Arizona border would alter everything he believed he understood about family normalcy. Nearly 20 miles separated the property from the nearest town. Hidden among crimson rock formations and withered brush, it displayed no sign whatsoever of permanent occupation. Porter only located it because a traveling merchant had vaguely mentioned that someone inhabited that direction. The wagon trail was ancient, marked by time and minimal use. When he finally spotted the weathered wooden structure, Porter noticed first the absence. No childish voices, no dog announcing presence, only dry wind scraping against poorly fitted fence boards. Smoke rose slowly from the chimney, indicating life within that isolation, which seemed frozen in time. A man of approximately 50 years appeared on the porch. He had a tall and lean frame, a beard descending to his chest in graying tones, and blue eyes transmitting deliberate coldness. His posture was rigid, hands resting in the position of someone prepared to repel intruders. Porter introduced himself with politeness, explaining his official mission. The man, identified only as Sha, responded with sharp brevity that demonstrated an unwillingness to engage with governmental interference in his affairs. Porter persisted as federal protocols required. The law mandated registration of every resident regardless of isolation or personal preference. Sean remained motionless on the porch for approximately 30 seconds, calculating visible options in his eyes. Finally, with a gesture transmitting extreme reluctance, he allowed entry. Welcome to the investigation that would reveal horror in a place where only protection and love should exist. Welcome to the case of the disappeared sisters and the man who kept them captive within their own lives. Where are you watching this documentary from? And if this is your first time visiting our channel, subscribe to follow stories that disturbed entire cities. The interior exhaled rancid lamp oil combined with bread slowly rotting. Rudimentary furniture meticulously organized in a precise pattern occupied defined spaces. Wooden chairs without cushions, tables worn by decades, bare walls except for a wooden crucifix above the fireplace, and a Bible open on an iron stand. 3 women executed tasks simultaneously, in a movement that disturbed Porter from the first instant. The oldest, appearing to be 28 years old, kneaded dough with hypnotic repetition. The second, near 26, hung wet fabrics while steam rose. The third, perhaps 24, swept the floor with technique suggesting thousands of previous repetitions. All wore identical gray dresses faded by constant sun exposure, tailoring that Porter recognized as being approximately 15 years old. What captured his attention was the synchrony. When Sean crossed the threshold, all 3 interrupted their movements at the same instant, turned to observe briefly, then returned to their activities with precision that eliminated any possibility of coincidence. That was a trained, conditioned response through extensive practice. When Porter attempted to greet the oldest one, she did not divert her gaze from the dough between her hands. Sha answered for her, providing name and age as an owner would provide information about his livestock. Sha Perkins, 28, identified as wife. The manner in which the word was spoken carried the weight of ownership that echoed off the walls. Porter recorded the information, but his mind began mapping anomalies. If Trudy was 28 years old in 1890, she was born in 1862. Abigail, 26, would have been born in 1864. Polly, apparently the youngest at 24 years old in 1866. The ages formed a sequence suggesting close kinship, not separate families. More disturbing still, none of them presented different surnames of origin. All shared Perkins as their previous matrimonial reference, a situation that defied all logic of separate marriages with a single man. When Porter questioned directly how many years each woman had spent as Sha's companion, the response came obliquely through Sha's statement. The time varied according to divine providence. The evasion was deliberate blocking. The 5 children played outside with movement suggesting more automation than amusement. An 11-year-old girl, 2 boys approaching 10 and 8 years respectively, and 2 small ones oscillating between 4 and 2. None displayed the vibrant health common in rural children. Skin showed excessive pallor. Clothing did not fit their bodies properly, patched multiple times with techniques suggesting urgency. One boy repeatedly executed a movement with cloth between his fingers, a gesture that seemed to be an attempt at self-soothing, a behavioral response to prolonged anxiety. When Porter approached with a friendly greeting, all 5 retreated simultaneously, as if connected by an invisible wire. Trudy's oldest daughter bore a mark on her arm that suggested violence. Porter recognized signs of physical abuse. When Sean returned to the property after a brief absence during Porter's inspection, the children's reaction was immediate and automatic. One of the younger boys visibly paled. The older girl assumed a slightly different position, as if her body recognized a threat before her mind could process it. An inaudible whisper escaped the lips of Trudy's 11-year-old daughter. Not a word, but a sound resembling a fragment of prayer repeated compulsively as Sha positioned himself on the porch. All children abruptly stopped their play as if responding to an invisible signal. It was a conditioned response through absolute fear. Back inside the house, requesting more detailed forms, Porter asked for proof of marriages. Sean's response indicated that he possessed no documentation whatsoever. His explanation centered on births occurring in isolation, certificates never obtained. This accounted for the absence of the children's records, but did not resolve the complete absence of matrimonial documentation. As Sha filled out additional sections of the form, Porter moved throughout the property in an observation that gradually acquired investigative quality. In the room, visible through a semi-open door, he encountered something that accelerated his heartbeat: pencil markings made on the door frame. At first, they seemed like a common growth record, the type parents make to document their children's height over the years. But as he approached, the disturbing truth gradually emerged. It was not a single record. There were 3 columns of markings, each beginning at progressively higher heights, suggesting that measurements occurred not when children were small, but when they already possessed considerable size. Following visually from bottom to top, the dates revealed a pattern that chilled his blood. Markings made year after year, always at the same time, always coinciding with periods Sha had mentioned casually. One column had marks so close together that the lines overlapped. Evidence of multiple measurements in a short span of time, as if Sha had obsessively tracked one daughter's physical transformation with a precision that went far beyond any educational purpose. The dates were scribbled over, remade, erased, and rewritten again at several points, as if Sha had attempted and failed to erase the record of his own crimes. The adjacent room had a door different from the others, not merely closed, but locked with an iron padlock on the outside, not the inside. When Sha noticed Porter's interest, he offered a quick explanation that centered on storage of supplies. The federal questionnaire did not cover storage areas. Porter did not insist, not yet. Approaching the fireplace, he spotted stacks of Bibles, not a single shared copy for the family, 5 distinct volumes, some with marks of intense use. Specific pages showed obsessive underlining in red ink, a pattern that repeated identically in all volumes. On the wall beside the room, a calendar hanging in the kitchen had specific dates marked with red lines. Dates that coincided with periods of approximately 4 weeks interval, always cyclical, always predictable. In the margins of a Bible resting on the side table, there were minuscule notes in obsessively small handwriting, references to specific chapters surrounded by symbols that Porter could not interpret, but that transmitted the quality of a personal code. More disturbing still, a paper folded multiple times was inserted as a bookmark in Genesis 16, the page that told the story of Abraham having relations with Hagar. The paper was so worn that it seemed to have been unfolded and refolded hundreds of times, as if Sha had obsessively reread it, finding in ancient scriptures justification for his own actions. In the kitchen, a diary rested open near the stove, pages ruled and filled with geometric handwriting that denoted excessive control in the formation of each letter. As Porter leafed through fragments, he found records that his stomach recognized as evidence entries about preparation for ceremony, with dates coinciding perfectly with when Trudy reached puberty. Notes about the process of divine acceptance followed by references to necessary training. Code that functioned as documentation of systematic abuse. Records of when procreation occurred, always in a calm and observational tone. In these records, Sean documented events with clinical coldness that transcended human comprehension. When Porter returned to the main room, he observed Sean signing the forms with the same geometric handwriting that filled the diary, the same obsessive precision. Upon leaving, Porter mentioned casually that he had observed height marks in the bedroom. He innocently inquired about their origin. Sha's response indicated they were records of the children's growth for educational purposes. While plausible in isolation, for the first time, Porter detected an expression of genuine concern cross the man's face. As he rode back to Bluff, Porter's mind systematically reviewed each observation he had collected. Obsessive markings on the wall, diary with records of traumatic events, room locked from the outside, 3 women with identical previous surnames, disturbing synchronization of movements, children bearing marks of violence. None of that fit a plausible description of an isolated rural family. A possibility formed in his mind as hours passed. What if those women were not wives at all? What if instead they were daughters? Bluff possessed a simple courthouse managed by Adam Brenner, an official who had observed population movements across the territory for 30 years. Porter presented himself with appropriate formality, requesting access to marriage records. Brenner, familiar with census procedures, leafed through books without initial hesitation. A search for Sha Perkins in the marriage records of the last 20 years produced nothing. Extension to the previous 15 years maintained the absence. No mention of Sha contracting legal marriage with any woman during any significant period. Porter altered his approach. He requested death certificates from the year 1871. Brenner moved to the appropriate section, leafing through until he found an entry dated July. Sarah Bennett Perkins, deceased July 21, 1871, cause listed as typhoid fever, leaving behind husband Sha Perkins, and 3 daughters identified as Trudy, age 9, Abigail, age 7, and Polly, age 5. The names corresponded with extraordinary precision. Instantaneous calculation revealed the pattern. Trudy, 9 years old in 1871, would be 28 in 1890. Abigail, 7 years old at that time, would reach 26 presently. Polly, the youngest at 5 years, would be exactly 24. Coincidence was mathematically impossible. Porter requested additional information about Sha's departure from the Salt Lake City community. Brenner consulted entry and exit records maintained by the early settlers. He found a notation from October 1871 indicating that Sean Perkins had departed with daughters for the Southern Territory, destination unspecified, and that his Salt Lake City property had been transferred to others. Everything aligned. The 3 women found isolated were Sean's missing daughters, daughters who had left Salt Lake City as children 19 years earlier, daughters whose disappearance had never been investigated publicly with appropriate seriousness. That night in the boarding house, Porter obsessively reviewed every detail. Sarah's death certificate, documentation of Sean's departure, observations collected at the property. Around dawn, he sought out Sheriff Melvin Rogers. Rogers, 45 years old, had built a reputation as a competent investigator. Porter presented evidence methodically: certificate proving Sarah's death, records documenting Sean's departure with daughters, findings at the property including obsessive markings on the wall, documentation in multiple Bibles, room locked from outside, children showing signs of abuse. Rogers listened without interruption. When Porter finished, the sheriff remained silent for approximately 1 full minute. His response was to inquire whether Porter had fully explored the contents of the diary that had been discovered. Porter indicated that he had read only fragments, but sufficient to notice a disturbing pattern of documentation suggesting systematic crime. Rogers acknowledged this with a gesture that suggested confirmation of suspicion. The sheriff initiated contact with Marshal Tyler Green in Salt Lake City. Green, federal authority with jurisdiction over territorial crimes, traveled 2 days through arid landscape to reach Bluff. However, Sha already possessed information. That following night, A traveler passing near the property reported having witnessed an extraordinarily large fire, volume exceeding that of a typical household fireplace, consuming something substantial in the yard. When he approached to inquire, Sha responded vaguely about clearing unnecessary accumulation. By morning, only ashes remained. Any documentation was irrecoverable. Green arrived on June 30th with authority to proceed. He brought Olga Hutchkins, a 52-year-old teacher who had voluntarily offered assistance in situations involving women and children potentially in danger. Morning of July 2nd, 1890 marked confirmation. Rogers, Green, Porter, and Olga rode for 3 hours through geographic isolation that now acquired sinister meaning. When they spotted the property, Sha was working normally. His daughters were inside the house. Rogers formally identified himself, explaining that answers were required, that the group would proceed with civility, but that honesty was an absolute obligation. Sha offered initial resistance. Green made his position explicit, hand positioned on revolver. That resistance would not constitute a viable option. Olga entered the property with the 3 women while the men led Sha to the adjacent barn. That forced isolation would be where truth finally acquired verbal form. Olga began with a direct approach. She explained that she had briefly known Sarah in Salt Lake City at an earlier date. She possessed knowledge that Sarah had borne 3 daughters. Those daughters had disappeared in 1871, accompanying their father. The 3 women at that property presented names, ages, and characteristics that corresponded with extraordinary precision to those disappeared daughters of 19 years prior. Trudy grew pale. Her entire body initiated a sequence of tremors that began in her hands and progressively involved her shoulders. Abigail and Polly exchanged looks expressing growing panic. Olga proceeded, explaining systematically the chronological facts. Trudy had been 9 years old in 1871, Abigail 7, Polly 5. The years matched, the names matched. Nothing about this could be coincidence. Trudy remained silent, her body trembling with increasing intensity. Then, without Olga having prompted specifically about it, Trudy began to speak. Her words emerged with profound difficulty, as if she were exposing them to light for the first time. She described how she had been told she was special, that she and her sisters had been chosen, that girls in the outside world were weak, corrupted, incapable of fulfilling their purpose, that they were pure because they had never been touched by any hand but his. Her words were structures of carefully constructed lies designed to make her situation not merely acceptable, but sacred. Olga touched Trudy's arm lightly and proceeded to explain with gentleness that did not diminish clarity that the man they referred to as husband was in reality their biological father. Revelation did not bring relief, it brought multiplication of horror. 19 years of their lives had been constructed on a foundation of psychological illusion. The man called husband was simultaneously their father and creator. The children they had brought into the world were genetically impossible relations. Their very existence violated taboos so fundamental that the entire community would consider them irredeemably contaminated. Abigail began to speak, confirming that her experience had followed an identical pattern. Polly simply wept uncontrollably, her body yielding as if the structure that had sustained her existence had vanished. In the barn, Sha maintained a composure that transmitted profound disturbance. He presented arguments centered on biblical interpretation, discussing a righteous man's right to maintain multiple companions according to divine law. Rogers presented Sarah's death certificate. Sha examined it slowly. His expression did not change. He returned the document without further engagement. Green posed questions designed to establish facts. The responses that emerged indicated that Sean viewed these women as his wives, according to what he described as a superior divine commandment. Green pressed further, demanding clarification about whether Sha had raised these women from childhood. Sha's response, after a measured pause, indicated that he had raised them according to divine designation, protected them from a corrupt world, educated them in purity. When Green inquired further, pressing about whether sexual abuse had occurred while they were minors, Sha offered no direct acknowledgement. He merely maintained that everything he had done existed in full compliance with a superior divine law that common men could not adequately comprehend. That non-response functioned as a confession. Sha was detained and transported to the jail in Bluff. The 3 women and 5 children were accommodated at Olga Hutchinson's residence. That night, Trudy positioned herself beside Olga, looking out the window at the unfamiliar street of the unfamiliar city. Olga posed a question about whether Trudy believed she would be well. Trudy's response came with disturbing singularity. She did not know what being well meant. That word had no reference in her dictionary of experiences. The following days were filled with methodical work of legal documentation. Belden Harrison, a territorial prosecutor with a well-established reputation for rigor, reviewed each piece of evidence collected with attention that allowed no details to escape. The death certificate proved the identity of the women as Sha's biological daughters. The diary had transformed into irretrievable ashes, but Porter had memorized sufficient specific fragments. The interrogations of the 3 women offered direct confirmation. Harrison's decision was consolidated quickly: 3 separate charges of incest, 3 charges of sexual abuse of minors, 1 charge of illegal polygamy. Conviction on all these categories could potentially result in a substantial sentence. Augustus Moore, a defense attorney who traveled from Salt Lake City, arrived on July 8th. A practicing Mormon of 52 years, Moore had accepted the case because his professional code required that even men accused of absolutely detestable crimes receive vigorously conducted defense. During an interview with Harrison on July 10th, Trudy explained how Sean had initiated reading biblical passages about marriage when she reached puberty. She described how he had reinterpreted sacred texts to suggest he possessed divine right to have relations with his own daughters. Abigail, during a subsequent interview, was frequently unable to speak continuously. Tears interrupted her narrative, but eventually she confirmed that at 14 years old Sha had performed a private ceremony, read scripture, and announced that she was now his wife. The month that followed represented a traumatic transformation that Abigail possessed no psychological language to understand or process. Polly presented an even more pronounced dissociative response. During portions of the interview, she behaved like a child, answering questions about childhood with vivid details. Then, without warning, she returned to adulthood, fully conscious and desperate. Olga Hutchins was present at every interrogation. She frequently needed to pause proceedings, allowing the women to recover from physiological reactions to reactivated trauma. Harrison, despite his determination to secure appropriate conviction, demonstrated visible compassion for the victims. On July 12th, Dr. Calvin Sullivan conducted examinations of the 3 women. His reports were graphically clinical. Evidence of multiple forced pregnancies confirmed physically. Scars from births that occurred without professional medical assistance. Physical signs that confirmed violations had begun when the victims were still children. As weeks advanced toward the trial scheduled for October 15th, the city of Bluff was in continuous ferment. Newspapers from Salt Lake City sent reporters. The narrative of 3 sisters transformed into wives by their own father was too sensational to be ignored by the press. Curious people from neighboring cities began to arrive. Sheriff Rogers was forced to reinforce surveillance around the jail when rumors began circulating about possible lynching action. Trudy, during those 3 months in Olga's house, initiated exploration of basic concepts she had never experienced. Olga taught her how a modern stove operated, how water plumbing worked, what technologies existed beyond lamp oil for lighting. She showed her newspapers mentioning the case with headlines describing horror in Utah and incest discovered after 19 years. Seeing her story printed in letters shocked Trudy profoundly. It was not merely private horror confined to an isolated property. It was public perversion. Abigail developed insomnia that seemed absolutely resistant to available local remedies. She awoke regularly in panic, her body reliving abuse while her mind slept. Abigail whispered numbers obsessively. Dates, ages, how many years she had spent in isolation, as if cataloging the horror could domesticate it. Polly had psychologically withdrawn to her room despite the door being physically open. Her relationship with food became disturbingly obsessive, periods of compulsive consumption alternating with periods of complete rejection. Olga recognized patterns of emotional self-harm indicating profound trauma remaining without adequate treatment. The 5 children began attending local school. Teachers noticed immediately. The children completely ignored European geography, did not understand that distinct religions existed, did not know that mathematical operations beyond basic counting existed in the world. Community prejudice, though initially masked by circumstantial shock, began to emerge as weeks progressed. The woman who sold bread offered significantly higher prices when Olga purchased. When Trudy tried to enter the fabric store to acquire material for a new dress, the owner refused to serve her. A woman who had been a casual friend of Trudy's before the discovery approached Olga on the street. Her tone was one of concern, but her words were psychological daggers. She expressed skepticism about whether 3 women living in isolation with a man for 19 years had not developed feelings. She suggested that perhaps the situation was less systematic abuse and more an inappropriate relationship that merely seemed criminal when viewed through the lens of modern morality. She insinuated that Trudy and her sisters might be internalizing a victim narrative as a way to gain attention and sympathy. Olga replied that she had never heard an argument so transparently structured for victim blaming, but she recognized that the comment had left its mark. Because even among those who believed Sha was guilty, subtle doubt had been planted. Perhaps the women were not purely innocent. Perhaps there was shared responsibility. Perhaps simply because they had remained, they had in some way consented. A local priest argued that if the women really wanted to escape, they would have tried to flee during the 19 years that they remained suggested complicity. Olga responded with precision that the 3 had been 9, 7 and 5 years old when they were removed, but the community narrative had acquired its own momentum. On October 8th, Olga received an anonymous threat left under her door. The message suggested that women who accuse respected members of the Mormon community should be prepared for divine consequences. Rogers reinforced surveillance. On October 10th, when Olga received correspondence containing formal greeting addressed to the 3 women, she discovered that Sha had managed to smuggle paper and pen into his cell. The letter was not an appeal for clemency. It was a manifesto. Sha wrote that he was a victim of temporal conspiracy, that he had been born at the wrong time, when men's law had become corrupted relative to divine law. He stated that those who called him abuser were actually those who had failed to understand his sacred mission. He maintained that history would vindicate him. He asserted that hundreds of years in the future, scholars would understand that he had been a prophet, not a predator. He proclaimed that his daughters, as they aged and understood completely, would recognize that everything he had done was for love. Love incomprehensible to the limited mentality of authorities who now imprisoned him. Olga burned the letter, but its words remained, disturbing evidence that Sha was not merely a man who had committed a crime. He was a man whose mind had constructed an entire universe where his crime was, in fact, a sacred calling. On October 14th, Trudy, Abigail, and Polly sat together in the room they shared. Trudy expressed determination that no matter what verdict emerged from the trial, they would never return to that property. They would build new lives, even without knowing how this would be possible. It was a fragile promise formed by pure determination, but it was hope, something she had not possessed for more than 2 decades. The territorial courthouse in Bluff filled before the opening on October 15th. Spectators competed for seats. Reporters occupied the front row. Authorities positioned themselves strategically around the chamber. 12 men formed the jury. Sha was brought to trial with deliberately respectable appearance. The magistrate opened the session and read the charges: triple incest, triple sexual abuse of minors, illegal polygamy. Prosecutor Belden Harrison presented the case in clear structure: isolation of daughters, biblical indoctrination, transformation into wives, generation of 5 children through illegal relationships. Witnesses progressed. Porter described the inconsistencies he observed. Sullivan confirmed medical evidence of multiple forced pregnancies and signs of violence. Olga established that the women had been psychologically manipulated since childhood. Trudy testified. Harrison guided her through confirmation of identity, description of isolation, explanation of how Sha had reinterpreted divine commandment. When asked about what occurred at 14 years old, her response came with growing difficulty. Description of how her own father had had illegal relations with her. Moore cross-examined in a manner suggesting consent. Trudy explained that complete isolation had made her unable to understand that alternatives existed. Moore rose with an expression of false compassion that was perhaps more destructive than direct aggression. He proceeded to ask Trudy about moments when Sha demonstrated tenderness toward her. He inquired about times when he was not performing harmful acts. He asked about shared breakfasts. He questioned whether there had been conversations where Sha showed interest in her thoughts. As Trudy confirmed that yes, such moments existed, Moore began recontextualizing each one. Did this not suggest she had recognized goodness in him? Had her own mind created a narrative of a man capable of both affection and brutality? Perhaps what she called abuse was actually a complex relationship she had simply reinterpreted as criminal when authorities told her she should. As Moore proceeded with this psychological recontextualization, Trudy began to cry, not dramatically, but in a way suggesting doubt had effectively penetrated her own victim narrative. And it was at that moment that the complete impact of a failing legal system became visible. It had not only failed to protect Trudy for 19 years, it was now failing to validate her truth. Even as the prosecution was occurring, Abigail confirmed an identical sequence with Sha. Polly was called but quickly showed dissociation. The magistrate ended her testimony. Sha testified. He spoke of protecting his daughters, of divine commandment, of biblical reinterpretation. When asked if Trudy was 14 years old when the relationships began, he confirmed. When pressed on whether he understood this was a crime, he responded that he had fulfilled divine designation. When questioned about remorse, he responded that he had nothing to be sorry for. Unwavering arrogance, casual admission, complete lack of remorse. The effect was devastating for his defense. Harrison presented his closing argument. Religious belief did not justify incest. Underage victims had been psychologically manipulated since childhood. Moore requested consideration of mitigating circumstances. The magistrate summarized the central question by calling Trudy back to the stand. He posed an inquiry about whether when she looked at Sean she felt paternal love. Trudy observed Sean for what seemed like frozen time. Then she responded with a clear voice indicating she felt only emptiness, emptiness where love should have been. The jury deliberated for 14 hours. It returned with a verdict: guilty of triple incest and polygamy, not guilty of sexual abuse of minors. Sentence: 15 years in prison. The courtroom erupted in protest. The sentence seemed insultingly mild for crimes committed. Sheriff Rogers noticed growing tension in the streets. Men whispered about lynching action. Reinforcements were positioned around the jail. The night of October 20th, 1890 was filled with agitation that progressively acquired organization. Men began gathering in taverns, discussing the fundamental inadequacy of the sentence. Apparently disconnected conversations interwove themselves into shared purpose through careful insinuation. Sheriff Melvin Rogers detected underlying currents of intention. He sent urgent communication to Salt Lake City, requesting federal reinforcements immediately. The response indicated authorities would be available within a maximum of 3 days. Rogers thus had to keep his prisoner alive during approximately 72 hours against vigilantes increasingly organizing themselves. On the night of October 21st, small groups of men began positioning themselves near the jail. There were perhaps 40 initially, some visibly armed. Rogers positioned 3 deputies inside the building with himself. Green, federal marshal, was sleeping at the nearby hotel. Rogers came out of his jail for direct communication with the crowd's leaders. He declared that he was protecting the prisoner under legal custody, that any lynching attempt would be resisted with lethal force. One man, later identified as Dalton Thatcher, a carpenter, expressed the crowd's sentiment that the community possessed responsibility for ensuring justice when the law had proven inadequate. Rogers replied that lynching was murder, that the community had no authority to execute its own sentence. Tension remained at a plateau for hours. The crowd grew to perhaps 60 men as the night advanced, but they did not advance. Rogers seemed absolutely sincere about shooting. Then, close to 11 p.m. on October 21st, change occurred. A new group of perhaps 20 men appeared, many coming from neighboring cities. They were more organized than the first vigilantes, more determined. Some carried heavy chain, not common rope. The leader of this second group, voice muffled by cloth, approached Rogers and communicated their intention not to leave. Rogers declared he would shoot anyone who tried to enter. For approximately 3 minutes of absolute tension, the men simply observed. Then they began circling the building, searching for weak points. Rogers immediately perceived he was being flanked. He sent a deputy to fetch Green. The first invasion attempt occurred when the group began using a wooden beam as a battering ram against the front door. Rogers fired a warning shot. The men retreated momentarily, but they continued battering. Rogers and his deputies constructed an internal barricade using heavy furniture, but it was mathematically obvious that resistance was merely a matter of time. Green arrived in less than 5 minutes, revolver already in hand, but even his federal presence did not dissuade the crowd. The door gave way at approximately 11:45 p.m. Vigilantes burst in like a wave through the opening. Rogers and Green fired 2 warning shots that hit no one. Rogers immediately perceived that physical resistance would be impossible. He lowered his gun, signaling he would not continue resistance. The cell key was demanded. Rogers handed it over. Sean heard everything from his cell: sound of door being destroyed, footsteps of the crowd, voices of men in collective frenzy. He retreated to the corner of his cell, finally realizing that conviction in his own righteousness could not protect him from physical consequences. The cell was opened. Vigilantes grabbed Sean, dragging him out as he struggled, attempting resistance. His voice was now only animal terror. They dragged Sha through bluff streets. Some citizens watched from windows. Children were quickly conducted to house interiors. Olga Hutchkins remained outside her residence. Her eyes briefly met those of Trudy, who knelt at the window. Trudy did not look away. She merely watched the man who had fathered her, who had victimized her, being led in a procession of collective vengeance. They dragged Sha to a sturdy oak tree in the town square, a tree with low branches that several men had apparently visited previously. Someone had prepared rope beforehand, suggesting the lynching had been less improvisation and more planned execution. Sha began screaming. He cited biblical passages with desperate intonation. He spoke of being martyred. His mind refused to accept that the physical world operated under rules different from those his theology had constructed. That final night, Rogers would later report that he heard Sean praying, not prayer of repentance or plea for forgiveness, but prayer of validation, biblical citations interwoven with affirmations of his own righteousness. Sean whispered that he was a martyr, not a criminal, that history would absolve him, that his daughters, viewed through the lens of future time, would understand that everything he had done was ordained by superior power. When vigilantes finally forced entry to the cell, Sha continued praying, not in panic, but in absolute conviction that even at that final moment, his God stood at his side. It was this lack of fear, this unwavering certainty of his own moral righteousness, that transformed his face into something none of the vigilantes would forget. Because it suggested that in his own mind, he had always been the hero, never the villain, that his entire belief system had been architecture so well constructed that even death could not penetrate it. The vigilantes did not speak. They merely proceeded with the act they believed to be justice. They placed rope around Sean's neck. Sean's final utterances consisted of statements indicating his daughters knew he loved them, that they knew he was right. Delusion that persisted to the end. The vigilantes hoisted the rope. Sha Perkins was executed by lynching minutes later. His death was immediate. The lynching had ended. Absolute silence enveloped the square as the community faced the consequences of vigilante justice. Then, as authorities finally approached, members of the crowd dispersed into bluff shadows. Sheriff Rogers examined the body. Sean was dead. He was 54 years old. He would serve 0 of his 15-year sentence. Green asked if Rogers had identified any vigilantes. Rogers answered that he had clearly seen perhaps 5 faces, but prosecution would create permanent division that would destroy the community. Rogers filed an official report declaring that unknown individuals had removed the prisoner. No investigation would be conducted beyond this formulation. Trudy learned about the lynching when Olga mentioned it casually during breakfast. Trudy's expression did not change. She merely continued eating bread with butter, her movements maintaining the mechanicality that had characterized her actions since discovery. Trudy eventually spoke, her tone neither celebratory nor lamentable. She indicated that he was dead, had been dead for a long time, and now his body was as well. There was no liberation in his death. There was no psychological conclusion to trauma, only recognition that that man no longer breathed the air she breathed. The following years were characterized by slow and fundamentally incomplete reconstruction. Olga Hutchkins continued to house the three women while they learned basic skills: how a modern stove operated, how water plumbing worked, what technologies existed beyond lamp oil. The 5 children grew up bearing the permanent weight of their genetically impossible origin. As they reached sufficient age to understand, they were informed of the truth. Trudy's 11-year-old daughter developed temporary muteness that would last 3 months. Abigail's oldest son disappeared one night, causing absolute panic. Found by morning, his disappearance had left additional trauma that no one could adequately process. Trudy never married again. She lived out her existence until her death in 1924 at 62 years old, working as a seamstress in Bluff. Neighbors described her as withdrawn, avoiding any mention of her daughters or the man who had been her father. She spent nights writing in notebooks she never showed to anyone. Abigail moved to Salt Lake City in 1895, her name legally altered in an attempt to complete escape. She married a widowed hotel owner who had been completely informed of her history. She had 2 additional children, but her mind remained fractured. Depression deteriorated her progressively. In 1912, at 48 years old, she left written expression reflecting complete resignation, indicating the emptiness was never filled, only learned to be lived with. Abigail died apparently unable to continue bearing the weight of unresolved trauma. Polly was the only one who found approximation to peace. She moved to California in 1893, her name completely altered. She married a traveling teacher who asked no questions. She generated 3 children. Built a life that would seem normal from the outside, but her obsessive behaviors marked permanent trauma. Door always locked, windows covered even in hot weather, exaggerated reaction to unexpected sounds. She died in 1941 at 75 years old. Polly's youngest daughter, conceived during the final year of isolation when Polly was just entering adulthood, had a fate that perhaps surpassed in tragedy that of her cousins. Born in California, where Polly had established herself, the child grew up with a mother who was simultaneously loving and psychologically absent in ways no child could comprehend. Polly never fully explained her history. She only said vaguely that she had suffered trauma in her youth. The daughter, perceiving that her mother withdrew physically from affection, interpreted this as personal rejection. She grew believing her own birth was a living reminder of horror her mother preferred to forget. When she reached adolescence, patterns of harmful behavior similar to her mother's began to emerge. As she reached adulthood, she developed obsessive behavior she had no context to understand. She only knew something was fundamentally wrong with herself, that her DNA carried contamination, that her own existence was a crime that had not yet been adequately punished. Sha's trauma had transmitted through 3 generations, not through biological DNA, but through psychological wounds that simply could not heal. The property where the 3 women had been kept was eventually abandoned. Wooden structures deteriorated under Utah's sun. The owner considered renovation, but abandoned the project after reports of bad feelings associated with the location. The Perkins case is rarely discussed in official historical records of Utah. It is an uncomfortable page the community preferred to forget. Systemic failures emerged. A community that did not notice the disappearance of 3 daughters, absence of child surveillance in rural areas, judicial reluctance to adequately condemn sexual crimes when victims were women. Willingness of institutions to protect a predator, citing appropriate scripture. Shawn's lynching, despite being a crime in its own essence, was tacitly recognized as necessary by a system that had fundamentally failed. 15 years seemed an insult compared to the 19 years of abuse the women endured. More disturbing is recognizing how many other families may have existed in similar isolation, never discovered because no census taker passed near their doors. Utah in 1890 possessed vast stretches of completely unpopulated territory. Families could disappear completely, their lives occurring in total parallel to civilization. The story of the three reclusive sisters and their twisted patriarch serves as a somber reminder that monstrosity does not always manifest through visible brutality. Sometimes it inhabits ordinary houses, wears religious clothes, cites sacred text with conviction, proclaims love while perpetrating systematic abuse. And victims shaped since childhood not to question may not recognize their prison until it is too late for any real recovery. Isolation remains the most efficient weapon of control ever invented. In 1890, it was geographic distance. Today, it can be psychological isolation, equally effective. The forms change, but the principle remains. Separate the victim from alternative perspectives, deprive her of voices offering different reality. Trudy, Abigail, and Polly lived and died without ever truly escaping the shadow cast by those 19 years. Their stories do not end with cinematic redemption or cure. They end with simple persistence, survival. Some survived better than others. Some succumbed to the weight, but all built fragmented lives from the ruins of stolen childhoods. It is a modest victory, but against the extraordinary adversity they faced, 19 years of isolation, indoctrination, abuse, followed by revelation that he who should have protected them had instead destroyed them. Persistence in its own form is an act of resistance. The oak tree where Sha Perkins was lynched remained in Bluffstown Square until 1934, when a storm felled it completely. Some residents interpreted this as a divine sign, others saw merely meteorological coincidence. They were daughters, they were victims, they were survivors. And their stories, however disturbing they may be, deserve to be remembered not as morbid curiosity for passing entertainment, but as silent testimony to human resilience in the face of the most fundamental betrayal that exists. When he who should have protected becomes perpetrator, when home becomes prison disguised as sanctuary, and when an entire community fails to notice that 3 daughters have disappeared. Their stories remind us that legal justice is frequently inadequate to the magnitude of crime. That true protection of the vulnerable requires not merely legal structures, but constant attention, questioning of convenient normalcy, courage to intervene when something seems wrong. Trudy, Abigail, and Polly deserved more than mere survival. They deserved whole lives that were never stolen. But since they were stolen, let at least their stories serve as warning for future generations.